Muy buenos días, es un gusto que estén conectados a esta primera sesión del Coloquio Internacional de Historia del Arte. En nombre de la Universidad Jorge Tadeo Lozano y su rector, y en nombre de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales y su decano Alejandro Molano, les damos la bienvenida a este cuarto Coloquio Internacional de Historia del Arte. Este coloquio es muy importante para nosotros porque ha tenido una continuidad cada 2 años desde el primero que se hizo. Diego Salcedo ha estado liderando estos coloquios desde el comienzo. Un agradecimiento especial para Diego por la persistencia en la realización de este evento, que resulta muy importante para el estudio del campo artístico a nivel local, regional y nacional. Porque el espíritu de la Tadeo con la realización de estos eventos, congresos, coloquios, conferencias, siempre ha sido un espíritu de acceso abierto, de hacer intercambios y de tener siempre un espíritu colaborativo con los colegas, con las demás universidades. Les voy a pedir por favor, Luis Eduardo, o silencie, por favor, Diego, a Luis Eduardo. Solo la recomendación, ¿no? Como siempre, apaguemos los micrófonos y las cámaras si no estamos hablando al público. Es muy importante, como les decía, para nosotros la realización de este coloquio, para la Universidad Jorge Tadeo Lozano, para la facultad y para el Departamento de Humanidades, que hoy en día ya no es departamento, sino área académica de Humanidades y Estudios Literarios. Esta área académica tiene 2 pregrados y una maestría. La maestría en Estética e Historia del Arte, que este año cumple 11 años. Para nosotros esto también es muy importante porque esta maestría apareció antes de que ofertáramos los pregrados y hemos tenido mucha pasión con esta maestría porque se ha ofrecido semestralmente, sin interrupción, durante esos 11 años y al día de hoy tenemos alrededor de 150 egresados. Entonces, en esa maestría se ha formado gran parte del equipo de tiempo completo de esta área académica y a partir de esa maestría se abrió el pregrado en Historia del Arte. Es el primer pregrado de Historia del Arte en Colombia, el primero en tener el registro para poder formar a profesionales en esta área, ¿no? Entonces, también muy contentos de haber llevado este liderazgo con respecto a este campo de estudio. Y por último, nuestro programa, que es muy joven, todavía no tiene graduados, pero ha resultado muy atractivo por el número de personas que empiezan a llegar de manera constante, que es el pregrado en Estudios Literarios y Edición, que también es una oferta novedosa porque tiene ese otro componente, ¿no? No solo la formación tradicional en literatura desde el punto de vista creativo, histórico y crítico, sino también se busca formar editores de profesión. Entonces, desde esta área académica siempre hemos sido innovadores y estamos en constantes búsquedas, de modo que siempre es pues una felicidad realizar un evento como estos, independientemente de las dificultades con las que hoy en día nos encontramos. Pero independientemente de las dificultades, pues también aparecen muchas posibilidades, ¿no? Y las posibilidades tienen que ver con hacer estos encuentros con colegas que se encuentran muy distanciados espacialmente de nosotros. Y creo que ese va a ser un sello distintivo de este coloquio, que tiene que ver con nuestras invitadas internacionales. Y en primer lugar, hoy a Griselda Pollock. De modo que dejo aquí la presentación para darle paso a Diego Salcedo, pero también para extender la gratitud a los organizadores de este evento, los profesores Diego Salcedo, Ana María Carreira, Carlos Eduardo Zanabria y Diana Guzmán. Muchas gracias a ellos y entonces los dejo con Diego. Diego, adelante.
Gracias, Elkin. Entonces, bienvenidos, bienvenidas, bienvenidas a este coloquio. Hoy tenemos el gran honor de tener con nosotros a Griselda Pollock, quien aceptó de manera muy amable esta invitación. Lo primero que les quiero pedir es que por favor todos cierren sus micrófonos. Vamos a escucharla. Ella va a hacer su presentación y al final de la presentación habrá un espacio para las preguntas. Las preguntas las pueden hacer en el chat. No vamos a abrir los micrófonos, sino las vamos a hacer en el chat. y escogeremos las preguntas. Hay dos personas que nos van a ayudar con esto, María Margarita Malagón y el profesor Manuel Londoño. Ellos dos son profesores. Entonces vamos a tener esa posibilidad de quien tenga cualquier pregunta, quien la quiera formular en inglés la puede formular, quien la formule en español la traduciremos. La charla no va a estar traducida simultáneamente al español. Y pues ya desde este momento voy a impedirle, pues vamos a bloquear la entrada porque si no se vuelve muy difícil. Vamos a escucharla. En todo caso, les doy la bienvenida. Esperemos que disfruten muchísimo esta charla. Voy a presentar a Griselda Pollock rápidamente. Nació en Sudáfrica, pero desde muy joven se trasladó a Quebec, Canadá, y luego al Reino Unido. Se graduó en la Universidad de Oxford en Historia. Luego obtuvo su doctorado en el Coloquio. Donde también se devolvió parte de Conferencia. A ver, un momento, perdón. Se graduó en la Universidad de Oxford, luego obtuvo un doctorado en el Courtauld Institute de Londres con una tesis sobre Vincent van Gogh. En la década de los años 70 se vinculó al grupo Women's Art History Collective, del cual surgieron las primeras aproximaciones e intervenciones feministas en el ámbito académico de la historia del arte en Inglaterra. Su vasta y profunda reflexión sobre el lugar de las mujeres y de lo femenino en el arte y la cultura moderna ha dado lugar a una obra de alcances innovadores y transformadores, tanto en la teoría como en la metodología de la historia del arte. Desde 1977, Griselda Pollock enseña en la Universidad de Leeds, donde dirige el Center for Cultural Analysis, Theory and History. Sus temas más recientes de investigación comprenden los límites de la representación, el trauma, la memoria cultural y la relación entre estética y psicoanálisis. En marzo de este año, recibió el galardón Hoover Prize del gobierno noruego por sus excepcionales aportes a las artes, las ciencias humanas y sociales. Entonces le damos la bienvenida a Griselda. So hi Griselda, welcome to our fourth colloquium, Live the Difference. We are honored to have you with us and looking forward to your comments and on gender approaches to art and art history. So we are really honored and excited about your talk and to have you with us.
Okay, so it's over to me now.
Yes.
Okay, I am so delighted to be virtually in Bogota and to be presenting to you. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to extend my global imagination. I have been to Latin America, to Argentina and Mexico, but I have not had the chance to visit. So this is great to make new friends and have a new community and conversation around the issues that we all share. So I'm going to do a talk today, which is very much a kind of review of some of the projects that I have undertaken as a way of demonstrating what this project of difference, the question of difference in the study of art history. So with thanks to those of you who have invited me and arranged this, I'm going to now share my screen. And hopefully we will have something interesting to look at as we go along. I will make this a full screen. So can everybody see this image? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I don't know how this translates into Spanish very well, this idea of not difference as a noun, but differencing as a verb. We are always going to be introducing some kind of concept of difference because difference isn't a fixed identity. We're not men and women here and there, north and south. Something is constantly creating difference, which can be creative, interesting, diversity. It can also be hierarchy, a power, an asymmetry of power. What is difference is something becomes the norm, something becomes the abnorm, something becomes the dominant, something becomes the subordinate. So we're constantly having to work at the process that is happening. I'm going to give you 5 case studies, or maybe we won't get all the way to 5 case studies, but we'll see, in feminist, post-colonial, queer, international, social, historical interventions in arts histories. Now, the notion of art having many histories is very important to me, because my career has been based on challenging the notion of there is art history, the story of art, which is largely Western, which is very patriarchal, which is very heterocratic, which is not susceptible to differencing. It's always fixing the dominant and excluding the others. So first project I had was to say there are many histories, some I can understand, some others will create and understand for me. And I intervene into art history from the space of something that isn't art history. I intervene into it from a space of a worldwide movement, from a wide theoretical perspective. I bring psychoanalysis, I bring Marxism, post-colonial theory, a whole range, and I bring them in to add to the mixture. But at the same time, I am an art historian because I have certain concerns with the power of the image and the history of cultural forms and cultural practices. But if I say feminist, post-colonial, queer, international, social, historical, it's not because any one of them has priority. It's not because I'm a feminist art historian who also does post-colonial or queer, but because they're all talking to each other. It's as if I'm always having 5 versions of myself, and I do something about women and somebody says, what about? So Gayatri Spivak always said, you must always ask, who is the other woman? Who is hearing me? Who is asking me questions when I think that I can give answers to any sort? So there's always a set of questions around me to keep myself in a state of understanding these as not labels of different methods or approaches, but these are obligations. We must constantly ask ourselves, is what I am saying heterocratic, heteronormative? Is it sort of centralized? Is it colonial in its discourse? Is it patriarchal in its discourse? Is it nationalist in its discourse? So these are questions and obligations to be thinking. And so what I thought I would do is to give you some examples. Now, this is my road to Bogota. I've never been to Colombia, but I realized I had a connection with it through this image, which some of you may recognize, by Cecilia Vicuña, an artist from Chile who lived in Colombia for many years. We'll come back to this image in a moment, but I placed that image on the cover of a book I edited in 1996. And you can see the table of contents on the right-hand side. The title was Generations and Geographies in the Visual Arts, Feminist Readings. Now, the book was a result of increasing concerns in the mid-1990s that there was a way in which the North and the South, the East and the West, had been constructed so that the story of art, the center of art history, remained Northern Europe, the North, as opposed to the global South. And also what we were finding was this Central European, North American, European sort of hegemony was allowing certain people in on condition that these artists who came from other countries represented their otherness. So it was called geo-ethnic mapping, like geographical ethnic mapping. You could be, you know, a Latin American artist, a Chilean artist, you could be an Argentinian artist, you could be a Korean artist, but the artist, without any notion, was Euro-American. So many post-colonial thinkers were saying we need to think how to do an art history which doesn't reproduce this idea of the art to which other people are being entered. So I came up with the idea of thinking about artistic practice on 2 axes. So each artist, each practice operates and can be studied across this double axis of being situated and being singular. So the first axis is generations, which means we are all born into certain families with histories that come to us through our family. We are born into the history of the place, the country, the globe at the point. We are therefore artists in time. It matters if you are born in 1949, 1989, 2019, 1599. All of these things are part of this historical framework, and that society is historical because capitalist modernity is different from medieval Christianity. Latin American societies have huge histories of ages and periods, and many working across the whole of the Central and Latin American continent, as does the rest of the world. And then the other axis is question of geography. Geography not as a place on a map, but a kind of social political geography of a particular society at a particular time that you are situated in, but you may also be not situated. The vast majority of contemporary artists, for instance, live in New York or Berlin. They were born in Taiwan or Buenos Aires or in Seoul. Okay, so we have a kind of movement, and some of this may be voluntary migration, it might be exile. But as we try to study each artist, we're not going to put them into a national or ethnic label, a little box. We're going to see how the work that they create occurs at the intersection of these different axes of time and place. So this book was a response to the challenge in contemporary feminist theory when it encounters the provocation of visual arts made by women in the 20th century. It was particularly that, and where I was focusing on issues of difference, but the two terms generations points to the singularity of each artist. I should read this in Spanish, which I can do, but the picture, I've got this terrible picture on the side of my screen, so I can't see. So, generaciones apunta a la singularidad de cada artista creativo en la nueva negociación del tiempo y la circunstancia histórica y política. Geografías llama la atención sobre la importancia del lugar, la ubicación y la diversidad cultural, conectando temas de sexualidad con aquellos de nacionalidad, imperialismo, migración, diáspora y genocidio. I hope that was not too terrible. You understand I learned Spanish to speak Spanish in Spain rather than in Latin America. And so you can see this double attention. Okay, now I can get there, okay. And then the book was, as you can read, I wasn't going to read this out for you, but it was questions of history and difference and questions of cultural difference and specificity of location. I did not wish to erase the differences between women by calling them all women. I was studying they all were all women, but each way in which they lived and experienced their gender, their sexuality, their familial, historical, political experience would be discerned in specific study of their works. Now, we all understand that we are to try and produce a more global or world art history nowadays, but the world is already mapped by power. So I learned a great deal from Latin American theorists, particularly Nelly Richard from Chile. Her key essays, I invited her to lecture to us in Leeds in the early 1990s. She was very shocked. She even took a photograph of the audience because she didn't believe that people in this northern part of Britain were interested in the art and the theory that is coming out of Latin America, but we were. So Nelly Richard's notion of the periphery and postmodernism, but also Gerardo Mosquera has been a huge influence on me, particularly his work on the Marco Polo syndrome, the idea of naming Eurocentrism, rather than just simply making the rest of the world accommodate and find its way into this unnamed phenomenon. So we do understand that the world is mapped already in power and wealth. And even this small indication of the wealth, distribution of wealth on the map makes us realize that you cannot produce a world art history without understanding the questions of power and difference. So let me come back finally to Bogota. So Cecilia Vincunia's Vaso de Leche, some of you may have even witnessed this when she performed it in Bogota in 1979, but that's like half a century ago. She did this performance when as you know, she was born in Chile, but she was in exile in Colombia after the terrible coup in 1970 by General Pinochet. But this piece of work, this performance, was about the fact that almost 2,000 children had died from diseased milk that had been provided for them in the city of Bogota. So she did this performance on the streets in which, using her interest in threads and obviously knots, the whole Andean tradition which she mobilizes in her, as the language of her work, she just spilt milk on the streets, just in the sense of the blood is spilt on the streets, showing how corruption and violence were the two sides of this contemporary society. Okay, that's going backwards. I'm sorry, something is... Okay. So we're going forwards. And I met Cecilia Vincunia in England, in Britain in 1974, where she was studying for a period. There was huge solidarity and huge awareness of the issues of Chile amongst the many left artists and activists. And she came to speak to us on the occasion of the first exhibition of conceptual art that was brought to London. And it was conceptual art by women, and no gallery in London would house it. So it was set up in an unofficial gallery, and around that we had a whole series of interesting conversations. And I bring this in because what we've already got is the sense of how language of art was changing at the point at which these great crises in history and society were emerging in the world, with the dictatorships, with the rise of American power, the turn to the right, all those forces that would reshape art. But this particular conjunction of feminist practice with the emergence of conceptual practice, moving out of painting and sculpture, enabled a particular kind of intervention. Now, I want to move now to my image again. Why did I choose two roads? Why did I choose this picture of a kind of fork in the road? There may be many roads, okay? But I really want to put you three questions. Before we can study anything to do with women or post-colonial or queer international as a kind of act of making different in art history, we have to ask, why are there great men artists? We cannot take for granted that there is just art history and they left everybody out and we're just going to add or slightly make changes around the edges. We have to know why art history has become the way it is. It's only got a 200-year history. It really takes off in the 1830s as a form of intellectual academic practice. It has different histories in different countries. But why is your typical bookshop in a museum, when you go to a museum or you go to a bookshop and you go to the section on art, what do you see? For the most part, you'll see a little section called theory. You might have something about art in the 17th century, okay? But for the most part, you will find rows and rows of books with a man's name on the cover. Or indeed just an artist's name. There may be some women amongst them, right? Why is that the major form? How are great men artists created? They are not spontaneous. It's a production of a set of practices and discourses. And the reason we have great men artists is that art history needs a subject for art and creates this individual subject, this subjectivity, as a way of understanding art. I call it individualism, but its particular symbolic function of a kind of icon of the rebellious or the creative or the genius that serves an imaginary support for those who recognize themselves in this great man image. So the forms of art history we have inherited are based on classifying art by nation. French, German, Argentinian, Chilean, Korean, Japanese, we have nation. We then have period, which century, which epoch. We then, in the late 19th century, they began to say it's all determined by style. We can have different kinds of styles. This gives us different movements. And at the core of each of these, you go nation, period, style, movement, you have the artist, the master, the great one, who is the master of this particular style, leads the movement, determines the meaning of the period, and represents the nation. And then you formulate the body of the work of the artist. So the forms of art history we used to have are, you make a catalogue raisonné, all the works by an artist. You write the monograph, individual name. If you're in a museum, it's a one-person retrospective. It's the big show everybody wants. It's often accompanied by an interview with the artist. And then all of this means you have a name-branded, marketed commodity. You buy a Picasso, you buy a Matisse, right? You are invested in a Rembrandt. The name, this individuation, is a critical element of it. So the first thing I had to do as a feminist was to deconstruct the mythology of the artist. And my object in this case was the most famous and widespread and popular image of the great genius, Vincent van Gogh. Vincent van Gogh, I don't know how you pronounce it in Spanish, in Dutch it's Van Gogh, it's got a things. And I wrote this article in 1980, which is my kind of manifesto of the mythology of the artist and the notion of genius and madness and art history. It's a title, there's meant to be two titles there, they gave us two of them. And I tried to write, therefore, a counter history of Vincent van Gogh. So I wrote in 1978 a book which was about Van Gogh's romantic conservative investment in the earth. Now, blood and soil is a very terrible phrase. It associates us with German fascism. He was a very profound conservative, anti-capitalist romantic, and he believed art was rooted in the soil, but they would not let us use this title. The best the publishers would let us do was artist of his time. So I'm already going to introduce a theme of the way that we have gatekeepers, people who prevent the radical thinking in art history. I then tried to do an exhibition to say Vincent van Gogh was not this great international artist. He was rooted in Dutch history and Dutch industrialization and Dutch peasant and rural life. So I did an exhibition which is preserved in the obscurity of the Dutch language because they didn't think it would sell outside Holland. No one was interested in Van Gogh as a Dutch artist. He had to be a French modernist. And then I did my PhD, which you can see is a very big one, on a topic which was to show that there was an alternative account of Vincent van Gogh and his relationship to concepts of modernity. No one would publish it. I think they may publish it in 2021. You can see that's a very long time, since 1980. Is that right? Okay. So So I want to use Van Gogh as a kind of case study here a little bit, because it breathes into the media. So Lust for Life, 1956, just as Jackson Pollock is killing himself and becoming this iconic figure of another kind of suffering genius, Vincent Minnelli makes a film, and he takes this painting, which everybody thought was the last work and was a painting that was read psychoanalytically, those three roads that lead nowhere. This is Vincent van Gogh feeling at the end of his life, unable to find a future. The sky is menacing and heavy. The dark features of the crows fly over. And Minnelli recreates that in fact, August, which he had to go and film there, as the end of the film. This is the moment that Van Gogh is going to paint this picture and turn back to the tree you see on the left and shoot himself. Now, even today, 2018, we have a film called Loving Vincent. And I did a lecture called Why Are We Still Loving Vincent? This was a film in which they explored why he died. It's like a police procedural, detective fiction. Did he kill himself? Did someone else kill him? Was somebody else responsible? This film cost $5 million to make, hugely expensive, painting these works by hand. It made $42 million profit. So this is still a profitable story. And then they find the gun. So they now think it's definite for sure he shot himself. So we have a great man who suffers and dies. And Julian Schnabel, the American painter, made another film in 2018 called At Eternity's Gate, showing us that we are still invested in this mythology. It's still current and it's being recirculated. I love the Australian artist Brett Whiteley, who decided to expose what underlies this myth is a voyeuristic fascination, a violent desire to witness this death. So there's something very dark underneath the investment in the story of Vincent van Gogh. So if we are going to difference arts histories, we need a double strategy. The first is to ask, why are there great men artists? What is the mythology of the artist? Sometimes it's sexual, as in the case of Picasso. Sometimes it's poverty, in the case of Rembrandt. Sometimes it's dying young, like Van Gogh or Raphael. But it's always mythological, and there's an underpinning violence. So before we ask why have there been no great women artists, we're not just saying why have there been no women artists, but why can women not enter into this category of the great artist, the artist? So this was the argument or question that was raised by Linda Nochlin, 1971, a powerful and wonderful figure. And she argued that the reason that there were no famous women artists, which is a slight shift because that's what she was really talking about, is that there's a myth of genius and women don't have it. And then there is literally institutional discrimination. Women are not allowed to train to be artists. They have less access to the means of being artists. So we have the myth of genius, but we also have the myth of woman, which is a correspondence that there's an idea of what the artist is as genius, which is masculine. There's a myth of what woman is, which is not genius. Now, about 10 years later, Rosie Parker and I, here the younger self, and Rojika Parker, who unfortunately is no longer with us, wrote a book called Old Mistresses, Women, Art and Ideology, which is, I think, being translated into Spanish as we speak. And we didn't agree with this idea that if only you could get rid of discrimination, everything would be all right for women. What we said was, you have to look at the discourse of art history, the pattern of statements, the ideologies that underpin the teaching and writing and preservation of art history. It's a systematic ideological discourse, which is endlessly repeated in the museum and in the university. So in Judith Butler's performative terms, you might say it's a performative iteration and perpetuation of difference, which has real social, economic, and symbolic effects. And what we have in art history is a value system based on an asymmetrical hierarchy, which this discourse constantly produces. It is not that women didn't get into art. Everywhere you look, there are women. It is so easy to find women artists in every period from antiquity to the present, and in great numbers. They're in the archives. They're in the great dictionaries of art that were created in the 19th century. It was not difficult to rediscover women artists, but it is difficult to shift the kind of terms in which you have to speak. So the minute I say there's a woman artist, now this is different in Spanish because you always gender, right? And so feminism in the Latin-based languages is struggling with this, the sort of artist, woman, artist, man. But once you have to say la artista mujer, you have already disqualified her from being la artista. Because you don't say, you know, a man artist and a woman artist. You say an artist and then a woman artist, an artist and then a black artist, an artist and then a queer artist. So the word artist already in people's imaginations means man, straight, white, European, and all the rest. So the triple strategy for difference in the canon is to deconstruct the myth and the academic discourse that produce and protect the artist as white, male, straight, able-bodied, and you have to analyze why it survives. A theorization and critique of the ideological system that creates the others, because you can't produce domination or dominance without having your negated other. So you have to have what I call the essential femininity, is that you, in trying to create this apparently neutral space called the artist, which is masculine, you constantly describe women as not so good, as weak, or as followers. So you always bring in a few others to sort of function as the negative of the dominant that doesn't have to declare itself in its true whiteness and masculinity. And then you have to create new concepts and different processes for writing a feminist, post-colonial, social, historical, international histories of art. You can't use the same language. You can't use the same concepts. And I think this is so important for people to understand. It's not enough to say there are feminist art historians and they just study women artists. I do not study women artists. I study the history of art in its complexity. I also analyze the discourse which has studied it to reveal its perpetual, iterative, performative exclusion. So let me just talk a little bit now about Old Mistresses for 1 minute, because it brings us back to Latin America. This was the first cover of the book. The artist on the cover is Marisol Escobar from Venezuela, who was then living in New York. I'll come back to her in a minute. And then it went through several versions. Each of them requires me to make a choice about what is on the cover. There's a new one coming out this year because it's now a classic. And as I say, it's being translated into Spanish and French, finally, 50 years after it was, or 40 years after it was written. When this book was published, the American publishers changed the cover. And I want you to look at the politics of this cover. We specifically put a brown skinned woman, or a woman who was presenting herself as brown or black, because Marisol realized when she went to New York that as a woman from Latin America, she was perceived as brown-black, not as white. And she made this piece called White Dreams, taking up Carmen from Bizet's opera, the gypsy, the sort of Latina, the Spanish woman. And her red rose is turned down and it is white, and she has made a face mask from herself. We thought this was to mark, this is an issue for the present, she's a contemporary artist, but oh no, the American publishers said no one in America will understand that. So they chose for this a picture of women studying, like pupils in a school, not as an individual artist. And what are they doing? They're learning classical painting. They're learning to paint from a female nude. So what you see in this painting are women as pupils or women as naked buttocks. And you contrast, therefore, this wonderful image of a woman exploring the question that a Frantz Fanon question of the mask, of who sees you as what. Am I seen as black? Do I see myself? What do I see myself as? What mask do I wear? Which was Marisol's question. And then here you see this picture in which the most conventional notion of what woman is, student or pupil and naked body, is reproduced on the cover of a book that is challenging all of that. So now we're going to have some encounters in what I call my virtual feminist museum, the place where I can show how I put things together. I hope I still have a little bit of time to get through these there more quickly. So I want to introduce you to the concept of gender and the color of art history. Art history not only has a problem with the question of masculinity, femininity, or man and women in a big divide, it also is already a discourse of race. It actively produces a racist discourse as much as a sexist discourse, and we have to be able to say that. So in 1993, I wrote a book called Avant-Garde Gambits, and the subtitle is Gender and the Color of Art History. It takes us back to Van Gogh again, to Lust for Life, to a scene in that film in which Minnelli sets up two masculinities, the pathetic man who's going to die, and we're not going to be sorry when Van Gogh kills himself at the end of Lust for Life, but the macho modernist is Paul Gauguin. Here, good man spreading, as we say in English. He's sitting there, and in the course of this little scenario in the film, this young woman will turn her attention to the sexual machismo of Gauguin. Now, we know that Gauguin was an ambitious artist, and with this painting exhibited in Paris in 1893 called Manin tout Pau, about a dream of death, he made his claim for the leadership of the avant-garde with Manet and Olympia in the background. We'll see that in a minute. What we are looking at is a painting made from a young woman called Tahamana, who was aged 13 when Gauguin, already sick with syphilis, married her under the rules of Tahiti, but perceived her as simply buying himself access to a virgin body, whom he used as his sexual partner, as his housekeeper, and as his model. He played the game of avant-garde ambition by taking the most famous avant-garde painting, which had just come into public in 1890, Manet's Olympia, with a white woman on a bed and a black woman watching, and he turned it and created this double image. It was called a brown Olympia when it was shown in Paris. Gauguin's trip to Tahiti had been inspired by the writings of Pierre Loti, the naval officer you see on the upper right, who wrote a book called Madame Chrysanthème about the marriage he contracted in Japan, in Tokyo. If you remember 1858, Japan finally opens up after 400 years of enclosure as the Americans come, and the French also enter. All the colonial powers start going to Japan. Lottie is a naval officer. He goes and he finds that it's very easy to marry or buy 14, 15-year-old girls who have been in hard times. They sell themselves. Divorce is very easy. And this is a novel that's inspired Puccini to create Madame Butterfly. And I'm going to show you something in a moment. Of course, anybody here who's an opera fan will know that in the opening scene of Madame Butterfly, the American naval officer says, "And how old are you?" And she says, "15." She's 15 years old. And of course, then we find a lovely painting by Van Gogh, which is called La Mousme. And Mousme is the word used by Lottie for these 15-year-old girls that these 25 and 30-year-old European men buy, buying, again, virgins. And I think it's important at this point, I'm not going to do it, but I would love you just to pick up this connection and watch Puccini, because Puccini replays this whole story, which we have with Jeffrey Epstein, and I'm sure you have the same scandals in Latin America, where underage girls are abused, taken into prostitution, forced prostitution, official kind of informal prostitution. We are very much concerned with this question now. It's one of the big scandals in the world. And here it is on art history. What do we do with that? Do we just continue to say, great, beautiful color? Isn't Gauguin a colorist? Isn't Van Gogh fascinating? Or do we listen to what Puccini did, which he makes us witness this 18-year-old woman kill herself out of the betrayal by the Euro-American man? Art can make us feel the pain of this, but we must ourselves also understand it and not omit it. I won't talk about that one. The other area is crucial that we understand is the question of space and the gaze. It's the one that is most misunderstood, the politics and gendering of the gaze. But also in the space of the 19th century that I'm going to be talking about a little bit here, we also have to grasp another concept, which is men and women, straight and queer, co-created modern art. It's not that there were the great men and a few subsidiary exceptions, the odd African-American or African artist, the odd woman. They co-created. And indeed, the Impressionist movement is the first fully egalitarian art movement in the history of art. They are absolutely, from the very beginning, this is a group who form as men and women. And they are doing this in relation to the experience of modernity, which has differential dimensions for men and women. So in 1994, I edited a book on Degas in the context of understanding the way in which 19th century consumer capitalism generated new urban forms of life and new ways that urban space operated, which sanctioned voyeurism. The 19th century city becomes a city of spectacle, and it is the voyeurism is the privilege of bourgeois men. So this is a question of class. The dominant class, the bourgeoisie, maps its rigidly divided ideology of gender onto the social spaces of the spectacular modern city as the site of pleasure and leisure. So again, sorry, to go back, sorry. You have the Spanish version on your right. I apologize for a very crude translation. The bourgeois masculinity enjoys the public domain as a field of power and pleasure, which is expressed by visual mastery, looking at others. But according to the same ideology, femininity is not empowered to look. It is to be not seen, to be enclosed in the house, and respectable women, therefore women of a certain class, are protected in a kind of domesticity and a kind of gaze of admiration and possession within the house. But this means working class women cease to be defined as women, because by going out into public, they are not, as it were, the bourgeois woman is protected, but they also become susceptible to gross forms of sexual violence and abuse, rape and prostitution, which is still a major aspect of contemporary culture. So I became very interested in those paintings that explored the question of looking, and particularly which undid or reversed the problem. And so when I came across the image that Degas created of a woman looking, even though her gaze is protected by these binoculars, I was fascinated by the sort of psychodynamics of the question of voyeurism, sadism, the castration. And one found that I had to take on the issues of psychoanalysis to be able to explore this, while also looking at this partner, this deep friendship, this deep intellectual, artistic conversation that Degas sustained over 40, 50 years with Mary Cassatt, the one American artist who became part of this group, who also made the thematic of looking in public within a certain space, women looking here at a play, therefore intellectual looking, while at the same time in the back of this picture you can see a man using his glasses to, what we call in English, to ogle her, to gaze at her, not intellectually, but obviously in this sense of voyeuristically. And how she then explored a series of paintings of the spaces in which women looked, but also had to negotiate this new kind of anxious visibility, which is part and parcel, I think, of every young woman and woman's consciousness. Fortunately, I'm old enough now, people don't look at me like this very often, which I'm very happy about. But since this was my anxiety as a young woman, every question about, can I walk down the street? Can I bear to be, as it were, suddenly treated, as Virginia Woolf talks about, as if I were a dog to be whistled at? So these are issues that come out and are played out in these beginnings of these paintings that plot out a certain kind of modernity and urban space. And it is co-creation. They are in conversation with each other. I'm not adding Mary Cassatt in, she's already there. So in the great and famous painting by Manet of the bar at the Folies Bergère, which is very much about the question of different kinds of women and their exposure to a certain kind of gaze. This is about a form of sexual solicitation. And I won't go into the detail, I think it's a really interesting painting, but I want to draw your attention to the background, where you can see masses of top-hatted men, of bourgeois men, with their lady companions, but one you can see has been painted with her binoculars. It is a reference to a kind of jokey inclusion of Mary Cassatt in this famous painting. So the fourth case study, we're moving on quite well now, is the question I had to ask myself 20 years after I'd written Old Mistresses with Rosie Parker. Why is the canon still in place? 20 years of incredible feminist and emerging queer and post-colonial interruptions of art history had not made any difference. It is still what was going on in the museums, in the exhibitions, in the teaching of art history. The canon of white masculinity and Western art was so in place. So what I wanted to undo that was to show, not only as I've shown, class and gender and sexuality in the previous example, but the entanglement of race and gender in colonial modernity. Modernity is always colonial. This is always already there, the issue of race and gender. So in my book in 1999 called Differencing the Canon, Feminist Desire and the Writing of Art's Histories, I asked myself, what do I desire when I do this kind of art history? What knowledge do I desire? Do I desire a knowledge of difference? And I can do difference in the sense of, you might say, well, I desire to know about what women have done. Absolutely, I need to know what women have said and done in all the history, because it's a way of understanding who and what all of us are, but also specifically myself as I understand myself or don't understand myself under this label, this term, woman. So first two chapters are showing what a feminist reading of art by men can be, in which I explored the question of fetishism and the father in Toulouse-Lautrec, a disabled artist. And I explored the fantasy of the maternal body caught between the absolute fascination of the plenitude of the peasant body and this sort of hideously voyeuristic and vicious image of the bending woman in the case of Van Gogh. And then I jumped from two 19th century to two 17th century paintings to look at the artist who had become one of the icons of American feminist recovery of the old mistresses, the old artists, anciens maîtres in French. And why I was interested is the picture at the top right of your screen is attributed to both Orazio Gentileschi and his daughter Artemisia Gentileschi. And the question, when you have a question of attribution, is what would enable me to make the attribution? Why would I think this is more likely to be by Artemisia than Orazio? This is not going to be at the level of saying this is what women do and this is what men do. I have to work it out from something internal in the painting. It's a painting of Cleopatra who is about to die. You can see she's still alive because of the kind of intensity of the grip on the snake, the poisonous snake that is going to deliver her to death. Has it already bitten her? And she's still holding on to it, moving it away from her breast. But when you get very close to the painting, you realize that she's not dead because her eyes are still slightly open. This endows this naked body with presence, with a subject. It's someone dying who is still there. You can't absorb this body because she's not sleeping like Giorgione's nudes. She's not offering herself up to be seen like Titian's. She has acted to take her life. The lower one behind is 20 years later. Artemisia Gentileschi returns to this. And I explored these two paintings in terms of Gentileschi's childhood experience because her mother died when she's 13. I am deeply interested in the question of bereavement. It's haunted me all my life. I've made it a topic of research in all sorts of ways. And it is that little sensitivity that made me fascinated by the ways in which she represents, in this ghastly painting, what death really looks like, what it is when no one is there. It's not beautiful like Caravaggio's Death of the Virgin. This is, the muscles have gone slack, the face has dropped, the eyes have gone back. This is someone coming in and realizing something very shocking. So I was fascinated, and maybe not to talk about Artemisia Gentileschi in terms of the usual story, but in terms of bereavement, maternal bereavement. But even when we come to the most famous painting where people read this as her revenge for the rapist, it was painted long before the trial. And I interpreted it not as a revenge of the rapist, but as an act of saying, I can take the place of Caravaggio and my father. I can kill the fathers and show my own agency as an artist. And then I jumped from that to this painting by a contemporary Black British artist born in Africa, grows up in England and becomes a British artist called Lubaina Himid, who painted a picture of two women of African descent sitting around a table, like some Paris cafe, against a yellow background and a flower of Egypt. And they are in conversation. And this belongs to a series she did called Revenge. Revenge relates to revenge tragedies, the mourning plays, the whole culture of the early 17th century that Walter Benjamin saw as the beginnings of European modernity and modern modernity in the beginning of the 17th century, where there were these masks, these plays, in which there is a relationship between Artemisia Gentileschi and Lubaina Himid, not of descent, nation, period, style, but two women engaged in activity. What is it to see two women in a painting? What is it to see two Black women in a painting? So I had to get back to that question by another chapter, which was called A Tale of Three Women, in which I went back to, the colonial modernity of the 19th century and put into conversation three women who all appear in Manet's paintings. At the bottom, you have Jeanne Duval, the performer, the writer who was associated with the poet Charles Baudelaire. On the right, you have Berthe Morisot, a painter, one of the Impressionist painters, who became an object of repeated painting representation by Manet. He clearly wanted to marry her, but had to marry somebody else. And then Laure, a woman whose surname we do not know. I found her birth certificate. I proved she existed. I found all the details about her for this book. She is the model from, oh, I should have go here. She's the, come back in a second. She is the model for the second woman in Manet's painting of two women. But Jeanne Duval, we only have Baudelaire's drawing, little drawing. We have a photograph of her by Nadar, and we have, I'm going to have to go back. She is a vague figure in the background of Courbet's painting, which includes Baudelaire. Angela Carter, a contemporary British artist, fortunately no longer with us, wrote a beautiful novel about the fate of Jeanne Duval, because in French literature, she's represented as someone who became a drug addict who was found ugly and old and poor and died in illness. And Angela Carter writes this lovely story. Well, what happens if she didn't? Maybe she just got on a boat and went to the Caribbean and lived a nice, happy life there on the, with an inheritance from Baudelaire. So the language in which Black women are represented is an issue of considerable, and how does the white woman get represented when you have a Black woman also represented in the same manner as the Berthe Morisot 10 years later? Now we come to this painting, which of course I've already introduced because it's a reference point for Gauguin's Brown Olympia. But the woman, the Black woman, the African woman, born in Paris to a mother who was already living in France, so part of the community of Africans in France, because it had been a slave trading nation and had liberated. She's first found as, on the right-hand side of this painting, as a nursemaid, looking after French children, taking a place in an image of the Black woman as servant. Manet paints a portrait of her, a very beautiful and sensitive portrait, not naked, just revealing her shoulders, looking at her jewelry, looking at her specific features, looking at this beautiful head wrap that he will then use again. Is that the same woman? Possibly, I don't know. Some people think this is the same woman, a painting by another Impressionist artist, possibly similar, but do all Black women look alike? since we find one Black woman in French artistic circles, is everybody Laure? And then we go back to one of the works by this white French woman, Marilyn Benoit, who in 1800 painted a servant slave who had been brought to France by her brother, who was an owner of slaves, who was obliged to sit for her, half naked, with the cap of the Phrygian cap of the revolutionary freedom, and with the red sash and the blue colors. So she's got the tricolore, and yet she's not free. We have some images of Africans in French neoclassical art, such as Girodet's portraits of Jean-Baptiste Belly, who is a deputy from Senegal who had been enslaved and then was freed. How different is the image of the Black man who becomes the political figure, the white woman, the Black woman who becomes an allegory for a freedom she does not enjoy, and yet she is given this wonderfully ambiguous gaze. She looks back at the painter with a certain kind of resentment. Manet put Laure into his painting in a way that de-orientalized her. He gave her the dignity of being a working class woman working with another working class woman. She has equal scale in the Olympia painting. But after Manet, they didn't learn the lesson, and we find these Orientalist pictures in which we have the desexualized, muscular, non-erotic body of the Black servant, again half naked, and the erotic body is the white body. Now, this will bring me quickly to, almost to my conclusion, to Maud Sulter and Lubaina Himid. They are the two women in this painting. They were partners. But the image is full of reference to Josephine Baker. Maud Sulter dresses herself in the style of the early 1920s, the great performer, the great political activist, the great civil rights creator, Josephine Baker. She also, in one of her works, presents herself in the mode of Jeanne Duval. She also makes a beautiful piece called Historia, which is to honor the African-American sculptor Edmonia Lewis, who worked in Rome in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, and died in England at the beginning of this century. And on the other side, Lubaina Himid is clearly identifying herself with the great cubist, queer cubist lesbian poet, one of the great lesbian erotic writers, Gertrude Stein. And we here see Man Ray's picture of the lesbian couple as a sort of husband and wife either side of the family sourside. And then the brilliant queer photographer Cecil Beaton did a whole series of images of the two, trying to work out how to create an image of two women as a couple that isn't reproducing some kind of husband and wife, dominant and follower, genius and secretary image. And this one I used in my book because they face each other, equally placed. It's a brilliantly interesting image to follow how Cecil Beaton arrived at this. And I think this is the queerest of the queer images he produced. Lubaina Himid is extremely interested in the fate of Black men in all sorts of ways, the violence done to them, the associations that are imposed on them. But this is her series, a very beautiful series of paintings called The Tenderness That Only We Can See, as she explores certain questions of Black masculinity in ways that only, as it were, a queer Black woman could do. And finally, I want to end with this, my most recent work, which is the culmination of all this trying to exploration. How do I integrate grand scale history, capitalist modernity, in this case, totalitarianism and the rise of fascism and the genocide of European Jewry, with feminist explorations of subjectivity and difference and looks and creativity and integration into the history of modern art, and at the same time deal with the specificity of those conditions that women, whether they're queer or straight, black or white, are subject to in a society that is so deeply phallocentric and patriarchal as ours. I wanted to call my book The Artist, the Nameless Artist, L'artista sin nombre, because Charlotte Zallerman has no name. There were no books published in her life. There are no monographs. There are no catalogue raisonnés. There are no contemporary reviews. She never exhibited in her life. So in art history's terms, she's not an artist. Nothing proves that she was part of the history of art. She may have made something. She didn't even sign her work, Charlotte Zallerman, because she did not want to be known as either Charlotte or Zallerman, which would give away that she was Jewish, and to be Jewish and a woman in the 1930s, and certainly at the turn of 1940, was a death sentence. So she signed her work C.S. She created a cipher for herself. But the men at the publishing said, you cannot publish a book called The Nameless Artist in the Theatre of Memory, because where would they put it on the bookshelves? I had to put Charlotte Zallerman on the cover. It had to become a monograph. But the book, I worked out after 16 years it took me to write this book, but what I needed to do was to think of a new double axis, not generations and geographies, but the event. Charlotte Zallerman's work is created in the sort of face of history, the rise of fascism, the beginning of the Holocaust or the Shoah, because she was murdered aged 26 in Auschwitz. She suffered exile. She's the victim of genocide. But also her whole work, which has been interpreted autobiographically, is not about her life. It's about the everyday experiences of loss, of women who are driven to suicide, of grief, of desire. And indeed, what I discovered, it's about child sexual abuse. Just to give you some basic information, Charlotte Zallerman was born and grew up in Berlin. She had to flee to France in 1938 after Pogromnacht or Kristallnacht. She was for a short period in a concentration camp in France. She was betrayed to the Nazis in 1943 and deported from Nice, where she was in exile, to Paris, and then murdered in Auschwitz, aged 26, on the day she arrived. She was murdered even though she was 26, reasonably well fed, and presented herself as an artist who could draw things. She was murdered because she was 5 months pregnant. That meant as a woman, she was carrying a Jewish future within her body, and all pregnant women were killed on arrival. But before she died, she made one artwork, but a big one. 784 paintings created in 1 year that form a single artwork. There is nothing like it in the history of art. There's nothing like it in the history of modern art. We don't know how to classify it. It has been misread as a kind of visual diary. So this is why it took me 16 years to try to work out what it is. She calls it an operetta, eine Singspiel. I've shown you here the structure of it. There are 3 parts: a prologue with 2 acts, the lives of various women, and then the rise of Nazism. A main part, which covers only 1 year in 467 paintings. An epilogue, which takes us from the year of her exile to the point at which she comes back from the concentration camp, in which there are 100 paintings. It's called Life or Theatre, 2 questions, life question mark, theatre question mark, la vida o la teatro. It's called a musical play. It has a playbill with characters, funny names, Herr Knara, Franziska, Dr. Klingklang, Professor Klingklang, Dr. Sing Sang, Amadeus Dabelon. She creates these strange names as if it was Bertolt Brecht and kind of play. And yet it has this beautiful piece that is a kind of like a memory page, which quotes from the psalms that are used in the Jewish services of memory on the Day of Atonement, and explains that she can't remember why she made this. It's shrouded in darkness. It was made a year ago and she's come back to it. It then has two statements, a statement about the origin of this work. It's dated 1940 and then 41 and then crossed out 1942, 43. We don't quite know when it was made. She signs it der Verfasser in a language which should be die Verfasserin. It's a gendered language, German. And it describes, the page is describing that it began where a woman or someone, a mensch, a character, a creature was sitting by the sea, and a tune came into their heads. And as they hummed the tune, all sorts of other memories and images came, and they sat by the sea and looked deep into the heart of humanity and painted this investigation into life, question, or theater. It's extremely difficult to exhibit it. You can see it's 784 paintings. It has overlays. The only time it's ever been shown in its entirety is 2017 at the centenary of her birth. It was created in exile in the south of France, where you can see the purple is what was occupied by the Germans. The white is the fascist French regime. And then she was just in Nice, which was under Italian control until the death of Mussolini. She painted it on that little promontory you see in front of you, the Saint-Jean de Cap-Ferrat. She registers the rise of fascism in brilliant paintings in her work. She also affirms her allegiance to modern art in paintings like this, where you can see she's referencing Van Gogh with his boots and his sunflowers. She's also referencing Cézanne. But what's important is all modern art was rejected by the Nazi regime as non-German. And she was given a gift by Hitler of the first retrospective exhibition of early 20th century modernism, because all of it was put into an exhibition and shown around Germany in this period. And I'm sure with her blonde hair and blue eyes, she was able to sneak in and receive this huge image of art, because she references everything. This is two paintings of her in art school. One showing here Matisse, her knowledge of Matisse. And if you notice this man in the brown shirts, this is an essay. All these militarized figures were there at the art school with her. She was the only Jewish student allowed. But she also went to Rome in 1934 and appropriated Michelangelo. So this is my great, I hope you can see the circle. This is the greatest of the great men artists. But of course, he's the greatest of the queer men, right? There's no doubt about it. Michelangelo is the great queer Catholic of all times, who's wrote on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel his exploration of this complex struggle with his profound Catholicism, his faith, and his profound love of men. And of course, it's represented in the wonderful scene of God creating Adam. And it is this Adam that you can see this painting, Charlotte Solomon recreated the Sistine Chapel, picking up on that scene of the Sistine Chapel. She also was aware of these transgendered figures that in the Medici Chapel, and she used them repeatedly in her own work, not only for a figure of the mother who is about to kill herself here, but also for herself on the edge of sexual initiation. 1938 comes the pogroms against the Jews, the Kristallnacht, and she is forced to flee. She's forced to leave, and she takes 15 paintings to leave. Her work is rather therefore like Freud, the study of what it is to be Jewish in the 1930s. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to follow this, but I just want you to see she, in her language of art, she is a product of modernism, but also the cinema. She shows an image of the farewell, but notice here in these windows, the agony of the train leaving And she's almost reaching out of the thing, this terrible thing of being wrenched away from everything. And then this final picture, which is somewhat akin to the final scene in Mamoulian's Greta Garbo, which was made in 33 and shown in Germany in 34, one of the great, great films. And I would love to show you the ending of that film, but that would take us too much time. But here you can see she is an artist who saw the coming of cinema, sound, mute cinema, sound cinema, color cinema, the musical, and incorporated it into art. She's sent to a camp after Hitler invades. And on the way back, we find this painting which says, "Rather 10 nights like this than one alone with him." Now, what is this about? You see a woman on the left and a man hunkered down. She's shouting at him. The scale of this thing is, it's being shouted out silently. And what it is that she is referring to links right back to the early part of this big project. This strange image, which is straight out of German expressionism, the vampire that haunts the domestic space. If you look between the legs of this great skeleton, you'll see a repeating figure of a little girl running to a door to lock herself in. You see this creature menacingly wandering through the corridors with its arms outstretched, its great grabbing hands, just like the vampiric figure in Murnau's Nosferatu. And what I came to the conclusion is that what Charlotte Salomon discovered by painting this great epic of the life of 3 or 4 women and 1 man in Germany from 1913 to 1940 was the crime that caused 3 of the women in this story to commit suicide, and herself to ask if she should commit suicide, was precisely this man. So if you look at the image in the center, he is saying, I don't understand what's wrong with coming to bed with me. I'm in favor of what is natural. These are the words of the sexual abuser. And she is saying, I know I can't do it. And if you notice that his pose is similar to the one of the monstrous Gothic figure that she imagines haunting the apartment from which the little girl first kills herself, her mother kills herself, and she is now exposed to him. So when we look at this work, we see the first painting is a 13-year-old leaving that very house, or sorry, 18-year-old leaving that very house, her arms wrapped around her belly, and she wanders through the streets, and if you look at the bottom, she's thrown herself into a lake and drowned. This is the final painting, and the final painting, I've shown you already, actually is the painting that's beginning to paint the first one. Work ends where where the story begins. She's beginning to blot out the South and do this journey into memory. And in painting it, she's trying to ask, why would an 18-year-old leave her house in the middle of the night, clutching her belly, and commit suicide? The probability is that she's pregnant by her father. So we see this great work as a kind of exploration of investigation into why do women kill themselves? And she is at the end of this point exposed to the very man, this monster, who caused the death of both his children and his wife. And just finally, we did not know until 2012 something very important. This filmmaker had made a film about Charlotte Salomon in the 1980s, and he'd forgotten that he'd been shown some documents which never became public, but he made a typescript. And in the course of that typescript, we discover she was in despair, to have gained insight into everything and then to have to take care of this puppet, this grandfather. It was winter few people could endure. Everything I did for my grandfather made me blush. I was sick. I was constantly beet red from mute rage and grief. Spring arrived. I had to finish, whatever it cost. What do I care about the police? Grandfather, I must go back. And we didn't know what she must go back to. But what we discovered and Franz Weiss produced in a film, is that in this final document that is outside of this work of art, she declares that she had poisoned his omelette with veronal, which is a barbiturate, and she watches him die. So what do you do when the victim of genocide, this young woman killed when she's 26, this extraordinary producer of this great monumental work of modernist art, reveals herself to be possibly, if not actually a murderer, but someone with the intent to murder? So we end up with questions. We don't know if he did die that way, but it indicates some kind of extremity, which takes us to looking at these artworks and the issues of beds, of sex, of suffering, of dying, of how artwork works this all out. And I hope I'm kind of going to bring this round, because this bed in the scene that she paints when her mother kills herself relates to this bed, to Van Gogh's bed, to Edvard Munch's bed, to the bed of Olympia, to the bed of Te Hahamana, Mana Tupapau, to Tracy Emin's bed, to the bed in which Cleopatra dies. So what I found myself understanding with the Charlotte Zalman and this different way of putting images together, tracing these different passages and relations and meanings of images, is that feminist analysis dares to speak about the different realms of experience, of social life, of embodiment, of psychosexual formations, and of human violation on a social but also a personal scale in the sociocultural formation, and also attends always to the specificity of the artistic practices which are historically evolving in relation to large issues like colonialism, empire, modernity, the city, genocide, fascism, where the questions of difference and dominance are always entangled, always at work, and always complex. So being a feminist, international, post-colonial, queer, international, social historical artist, historian, is not a matter of having an approach for women, an approach for questions of sexuality, an approach for social formations. It's perpetually seeing they're always already there. And part of the obligation of us is to sensitize ourselves to the sense that it's always at work and it's visible in front of us. And I hope I've shown you that by taking some of these great artists' works, as well as the works of integrating the presence of women working with that and against that, and what it takes to read, to do feminist readings and feminist interventions into arts histories. Why study art history? Because it teaches us to see images, teaches us to see them historically. And I will leave you now and say thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Griselda. It was an astonishing presentation and talk. I'm without words. But I think the best things, if you agree, is that people they are allowed to ask you the questions directly. I guess that is probably more interesting, and probably you can see also their faces. So I don't know if someone has a question, si alguno de ustedes tiene alguna pregunta. Griselda told me last time that she can understand Spanish, so if you want to ask the question in Spanish, there is no problem, and in any case, we are here to attend any translation that probably you will need. So there is one message. Okay, so let's see.
Yep.
The Ricardo Malagon, and before that, Jairo Salazar, who was also a professor from our university. Now he's in Canada. He said, Dr. Pollock, thank you for your great presentation in correspondence to your analysis of the dissemination and perpetuation of the art canon and the masculinist gaze in art and popular culture. What is your input on the potential effects of the increased use of social media and webinars as digital alternatives for historians, museums, and art galleries to keep their exhibitions and activities actively flowing during the current pandemic? Thank you.
That's a wonderful question, and thank you very much for asking it. I have a few thoughts that are raised by this. On the one hand, when you go to a museum, even though the museum, the building, the architecture, the spaces you have to go through, either you have to pay, or there's a shop, or there's a cafe, and then you get to your exhibition, and then there are the boards around it saying, you know, making sure you know what you're seeing in every room and what the proposition is. This is all framing your expectation. This is all about inducting you from the public space into the special space, into the ways of behaving. You're usually quiet and silent. You maybe talk a little bit to your colleagues, and you are always being given a pre-framed experience. But at the same time, the pictures or the art objects break out of the frame. You can always move backwards and forwards. You can go to the end and come back. You can look for yourself. So that's why I'm very interested in my virtual feminist museum. It was not an internet museum. It was this sense that we create a whole set of meanings under the radar of the official meanings that are being given to us. Nonetheless, the official meanings are what most people go and consume. And then they come out and they buy the catalog and they've consumed that story. Now, the museum therefore has this possibility of us doing different things, and artists go into museums and they don't follow the art historical story. They say, oh, Titian's got a really interesting painting practice, I need that, or I'm going to look at this way of doing form, you know, in a medieval building, even if I'm making something today. They don't think art historically in the same way, so that's always an open space. Once you put it online, in this sort of way, it's even more programmatic. It's even more likely to go through their, what I would call their dumbing down, their prescribing, their setting the terms, right? Because I don't have the freedom to stand in a room and ignore, or to run backwards and forwards, or I don't know about you're going to museums, but if I go with other people, we sort of say, have you seen this? Let's go somewhere else. Or maybe we make these connections. We create our own experience of this, and we're being deprived of that. On the other hand, I think these webinars are fascinating, just like today. I didn't have to use up all that carbon, you know, lose 5 days of my life to make a journey, right? I'm deprived of the conversation that would happen before and afterwards. So I'm deprived of all the kind of informal social connections, which is something to do with isolation. And I think that is something that's going to have huge impact on us, because this form of social isolation and imaginary conversation has implications. Now, I don't have the answer to them and I don't have the analysis yet, but I am afraid on the one hand, the first part of your question, that this becomes even more regulated and prescribed, and the public is never given access to more complex ways of understanding. Because museums and art histories are very much a gatekeeper to make sure the right story is given, right? You don't have the freedom to do it, but obviously on the side, we have the freedom to do this. And this can go online and people can listen to it more than if it was just a one-off in the real sense. But I think the deeper implications of the virtualization of our world is not at the point of our interface, but in the conditions, right? I haven't spoken to anybody in the flesh other than my daughter and 2 others and a few delivery people for 6 months. Now, as an academic, you know, a workaholic academic, I'm in heaven. I can stay at my computer, which is very bad for me. But these are things I think that we will find artists exploring. And I'm actually giving some of my Holberg money to a group of contemporary artists in Leeds to explore this from the conditions in which they're having to make art. And I would wait for the artists in some sense to as it were, combine with theorists and conversations about what is this world now, not as just weird times and strange times and terrible times, but how would these categories that we've built up, like the question of space, of social interaction, of not looking in people in the eye. I can see, you know, I can actually, everybody else has got themselves turned off, so I can see Diego only on my sort of list, right?
Yeah.
So I'm talking into the, I have no idea. And also, as giving this lecture, as I looked just at my own screen, it was completely, I was going to say autistic in a sense, that I was allowed to go on talking and I couldn't see somebody saying, you know, looking at the watch, come on, shh, you know, all those things. I couldn't see people turning off or going out for coffee, or how many people switched off and just said they'd watch it later. There are many, many elements of this which are very available for cultural analysis and for artistic exploration of how this would be represented back to us. So I thank you for that question.
Okay. So I don't know what's happened with the video.
There's
but
lots
no, I
of
think,
questions.
yeah,
Okay.
there is a lot of questions. Do you have, okay.
Yeah,
Probably
okay.
the second one was from Ricardo Malagon. So I don't know if Margarita wants to translate that or.
No,
Yes,
okay.
sure.
Okay.
So Ricardo asks, well, you have the question there in Spanish, but basically he's asking, do you think that your work, which includes multiple complex perspectives, is somehow related to the new cultural history?
Thank you for that question. I'm thinking about the new cultural history. I mean, I am also the director of a Center for Cultural Studies, and we founded a degree and an MA, a master's degree, and a BA, an undergraduate degree in cultural studies. And we have always combined the notion of cultural theory and cultural history. So I've been very influenced by, you know, Robert Darnton and some of the later, I don't know who you're thinking of in terms of this notion of the new cultural history. But it's what makes it different from the culture. I mean, and Robert Darnton as a cultural historian makes very good sense. I introduce him to my students on the basis that studying cultural history is a way of realizing not only that the past was very strange, they did things we don't understand. They laugh at jokes we do not find funny. They perform in ways that make no sense to us, but it makes you reflect on how complex and how peculiar we are. So that it is all part of undoing the notion that the norm is, you know, almost invisibly the environment in which you breathe, and then everything else is different. So as a cultural historian, as well as a historian and an art historian, yes, certainly. But I think what is specific about what I'm doing is to say, here we have this minor subject, art history, not a big discipline like history or sociology or literature, but actually we have a huge symbolic investment in material culture, buildings, heritage, and images, and that the artist is a symbolic figure way beyond the limitations of art historical teaching and practice, which is why I'm so interested in Van Gogh. It's this image of the artist that is a symbolic representation of something. So I think, again, cultural historians, more than art historians, look at the question of cultural imaginations and mythologies and overlaps with anthropology and sociology. So I'd say yes, but the specificity is there's something about the way images work, and there's something about the way the images work in relation to social and cultural formations that requires a specific discipline to analyze them, because most historians use images as illustrations. They don't look at the internal logics and materialities and technologies and representational processes, semiotic processes that constitute how an image, whether it's a literary or a cinematic or a visual image or a performative or gestural image, a dance, actually produces meaning. And I think those two things are crucial to hold in tension. It does mean, I do think teaching art historians needs to include their being thoroughly aware of a whole range of different models of thinking, the social, the cultural, the historical, and the aesthetic. And that's what I think makes art history the most difficult discipline, because we have all of that plus the specificity.
Thank you. So probably, I don't know, voy a pedir que las personas que la hicieron en inglés pueden abrir sus cámaras. Griselda dice que le gustaría verlos. Entonces, no sé si yo estoy bloqueando algo. Perdón si lo he hecho, porque es que no, no soy muy experto en el... Ah, no, aquí están, sí, en el Zoom. So, por ejemplo, la de Haidar, creo que la podrías hacer con tu voz y en la cámara.
Okay.
Okay, so there is another one here.
Yeah, I've read that. I've read Haidar.
Okay. Okay.
So he's asking if I would call Charlotte Zalman a genius. No, I don't need the concept of genius. I think the concept of genius is already investing somebody who is part of the world with us, but is a particular person with some kind of symbolic significance beyond that. Okay, I don't need the concept of genius. I need the understanding of the work they do. And I need to be able to explain why it's worth studying that work. So having an artist who was as invisible in art historical terms and unknowable, she left no notes other than this work. There's no way of using all that usual kind of biographical and, you know, sort of hype that goes with it. I have to just say, what is this work doing? And in that sense, I think it is a remarkable work of modernist art, and I can make that case. But, you know, I don't have to endow her with anything other than what it is that the work itself has done. And I don't know her any better at the end. Just as I said, we're left with this, who was this person, right? Who could have, you know, what happens in this work? It's all in the work. And that's why I'm also interested in this idea of co-creation. It's not that there are couples in art, or we can have partners in art, and, you know, all sorts of books that have come out. There's a big exhibition in London recently on famous couples in art. I want us to understand that all art is created in intense conversations between people who choose to compete with each other, be fascinated by each other, support and respect each other, and debate. How are we going to do this? And that, I think, is much more interesting than individuating geniuses and giving us hierarchies and all the rest of it.
Okay, thank you. And there is another one, Samuel. Can you read?
Yeah. Talking about the hero biography. So what do we do when we are taking women, Black people, LGBTIQ people, and Indians that remain unknown using the same device? Now, that's partly, again, while I ended my lecture with Charlotte Zalman, because I wanted this, you know, 26-year-old Jewish woman artist to be a kind of precisely a figure of what do you do when none of the rest of the sort of apparatus secures their place in history on the basis of these value systems that are kind of the test you have to pass. So again, the question of the artist. If you already have a notion of what an artist is, and these people aren't there, we're going to be in trouble. Now, we know that the vast majority of art in the world has been made without artists. you know, Hans Belting, writing about the medieval world, calls it, you know, images before art. The concept of art and the concept of artists is a Renaissance and Enlightenment, and it's a modern invention. The vast multitude of people who make what Gerardo Mosquera calls symbolic aesthetic practices. I mean, that was the term he was using in the early 1990s to say, if you're going to be decolonizing art history, you have to recognize that people have made art, you know, as shamans and religiously and this and that and the other, etc. And this concept of the secular, individual, professional artist is a construction that has its roots in the origins of modern Western individualism. So when you are asking yourselves, what is it they do? I mean, there are individual creators and producers always who are interesting, but we have symbolic aesthetic practices, i.e. practices that are rooted in materiality, technology, procedures, you know, people interested in sand or thread or all these sorts of different kinds of things. It's another thing which was in Old Mistresses. We insisted on showing that this hierarchy between paint on canvas or marble and bronze, you know, was a hierarchy in which everything made in textile is seen as craft. Now, the vast majority of art in Africa, there is metallic work, there is, you know, some of the greatest sculptures, some of the greatest woodwork and metal work, etc. But a vast amount of art is made in cloth, right? And again, Cecilia Vincunha with this question of thread. So when you look at the sort of feminist interventions and both artists working with and artists outside of this, who are, you know, creators outside of this, we have to keep undoing these hierarchies and question this artist figure that seems to be the only way you justify this. At the same time, obviously, there are women, people of African descent and people of indigenous descent and ethnicities and people of different sexualities who do understand themselves professionally as artists, right? Who are participating in a modern economy of artistic production. And that's very interesting. For instance, in the First Nations people in Canada, you find very interestingly how First Nations artists are remaining remarkably faithful to the continuing vitality of First Nation, what I'd call the imaginaries of their, that, you know, sustain their creativity, but also they negotiate their intersection with this alien colonial imperial other in strategic ways. So negotiation is also another crucial point. And I think that's what, again, Mosquera is writing about in terms of how to speak back to the very frames of Western masculinist, you know, canons that make you appear different. So people will remember the Magicien de la Terre exhibition in Paris in, you know, 1889, you know, where you had all the named artists and then you had these unnamed indigenous people who came and did things who are themselves part of the exhibition. They were on exhibition, right? But now I think a lot of the artists from the global south and other places have an understanding of how they're going to have to negotiate the terms of encounter. So I think we need to be aware that we can talk about creators and producers and respect people for artistic practice, but the concept of the artist, when it becomes a box somebody's tried to be fit into, will deny the complexity of artistic practices on a world scale.
Okay. And there is another one, and the last one, Eli Garzón, can you see? Can you read? Okay.
So this is a group of feminists in Mexico intervened and altered certain paintings of national figures, art conservation, feminist protests, Black Lives Matter. This is obviously a kind of debate that is running around the world. And I find myself divided. If images are powerful and are serving as this kind of maintaining the political unconscious of a society, we need to question them. And sometimes, in certain cases, remove them. But if it's done in the form of isolated action, it then becomes destruction. So in South Africa, from where I was born, the roads must fall, that movement, which then became patriarchy must fall, is a movement. That's to say, it has a basis in a whole range of people coming together and engaging in very deep discussion about the power of the symbolic power of representation, what images do, what they mean. And then one has to devise strategic as well as tactical. So strategic are long-term interventions, which do involve us in self-education and transformation and reading, and tactical moves, which might be to draw attention of people to this power of the image and what they empower. Because if you knock down a statue, what people get is somebody destroyed a statue. It takes a lot of stages to say, what is a statue? Why is it there? What does it represent? How did it come to be? What kind of culture does this, right? What kind of culture invests in this kind of speech acts all across the city or on buildings? And wouldn't it be more interesting to take people on tours of cities and make them read the city and discover in themselves the political consciousness that something isn't just a picture of that's a good or a bad picture, but it's part of a kind of sentence, a series of words that make sentences, that make paragraphs, which make entire stories that we are daily accepting. So I think this is like the place where art history can step up and say, we can start this conversation rather than a kind of problem that I think we have now, which relates to social media, which is a form, right? I'm not judging it. I just, I know I'm a kind of golden oldie. I mean, I'm too old to sort of, I don't do it. I'm never going to do it. I've always thought it was an advertising plan. I knew from the beginning that all of social media is going to exploit all sorts of desires for connection and self-presentation on the basis of somebody accumulating a way of making an enormous amount of money from us. It runs through advertising. The minute you understand that, you say, never again will I use any of the social media. And yet the benefits of this kind of communication, but what happens to it is it's a form of communication that is constantly, it's semantically restrictive. Many, many years ago, when they studied the question of class in education, people explained that children who come from families where their parents do not speak to them in more than 5 words at a time, or are not exposed to language, are always going to be disadvantaged in education. Now, they've slightly got rid of this idea, but it was this idea of a kind of semantic impoverishment. And thought happens in words. And I say this from my deepest heart because everybody says to me, none of your books will ever be popular because nobody can face thinking at this level all the time, right? The things that we have to think with in order to do that. I struggle to make these things accessible in all sorts of ways, but thought is a complicated process, and the social media is turning very complicated questions into slogans. And we know that the slogans are always the instrument of fascism. So we have to fight for thought and for complexity, even though I absolutely think the issue is incredibly important. And it's why, even when I first started doing this, I would go into museums and I would photograph the first thing I saw, and it would always be a nude female. The thing that indicated I'd gone from the everyday world into art was a naked woman. I mean, I think I have 50 photographs of this everywhere you go. How do I know I'm in the art world? There's a naked woman. Why can't, you know, am I meant to take my clothes off and say, okay, that's what women do? No, that would get me rushed out immediately and arrested for indecency, right? So you know, there's the French artist who did this thing where in front of Courbet's Origine du Monde, or you know, the origin of the world, basically a picture of a woman with her legs open. She sat there and did the same, and she was arrested for pornography. So these are very real, these you know, symbolic elements in relation to how they're cut up, like, but we have to think them through. So that's my feeling, that art history is precisely a contribution to this conversation. And what matters is people learn the politics of what's being done to them by the absence of certain images and the presence of certain other ones. You know, and it's not enough to say, well, we've got to get rid of all these images of slave owners, because then you have to actually say, you know, a much more complicated issue around, it doesn't tell you anything about capitalism, about enslavement and its histories and the African involvement in it and the economies of it, and what is involved in saying another human being can be a chattel, right? Because we do this with refugees now. The whole sense of the people who have no rights, who are treated in the way that they are now, we are doing the same thing. That's why I'm interested in this idea of the concentrationary. And so I think these are areas where we need much more subtlety than the you know, the media ever allow us. But then, okay.
There are the three other questions, and I think that's it.
Okay.
So this is another one.
From Claudia?
Yes, Claudia.
Okay. In the case of Charlotte Salomon, taking into account her condition, have you considered the studies of migration and exile in art history? This is a really interesting question. Okay, do you study histories of exile and migration, or do you learn about what exile and migration means from the study of the artworks produced by this person, that person, the other person? So I certainly have, but my methodology, as I've shown it today, is I go through specific works. I arrive at the big question from the specific, what I call formulation, the aesthetic, the pathos formel. I've become a bit of a Warburg, a feminist Warburgian, but I really like this idea of formulation. So I've written about Alina Shapochnikov, particularly I wrote about Anna Maria Maiolino, because I found that a very interesting thing from someone born into conditions of famine in post-war Italy, forced out of poverty and hunger to go to Venezuela, and then she went to Brazil, and then of course she writes very powerfully about, you know, being a Spanish speaker on the streets of New York, where everybody else ignored her, but the only place she could speak to anybody was in places where the Americans also ignored them in terms of the Latino community. These are very complex stories which are bonded into the artworks. So exile and migration is part of my history. I'm a foreigner, right? I mean, when they had great debates in Britain about, you know, Brexit and get rid of the migrants, immigrants, I said, excuse me, you know, I've only had a British passport for a very short time of my life. You know, I was an immigrant in every society. I belong nowhere. I have no right to have been born on the African continent. I had no right to be a Canadian except as an immigrant into the First Nations country. I'm a foreigner here. It's very, very close to my sense of myself. And, you know, if you're Jewish, you just know that this is, you know, dangerously tropic. It becomes a trope, but I want to work it out through each artwork. How is it articulated? How is it formulated? How is that amongst one of the many other things that's generating the specificness of this form?
There is another Claudia.
Okay, Claudia,
yeah.
to talk about the genius myth and the woman myth and the artist stories that our society is more likely to buy. Do you believe the current wave of feminists is generating new women myths? I think there is a contemporary myth of feminism because I think it has been and always was on the verge of being appropriated. So I want to just be a little bit like didactic historically. From my perspective, around the 1980s, we see, or the 70s and 80s, we were witnessing the rise of neoliberalism and capitalism was one. And part of that was that they said, there's an awful lot of nicely behaved, non-ambitious workers, women, who would be very good to bring into the economy. And so we found an increase of women in employment, and they're going up to kind of middle management. Very few of them want to go to the top, and they go off and have children. They're quite happy with a certain kind of thing. At the same time, we have the women's movement, this very, very radical questioning, right? Which did ask for women's economic independence and the choice, the possibility of work, because economic independence gives you autonomy. It's the one central issue that women always recognize. If I haven't control of my own living, I'm dependent. These are two different trajectories, like my two roads, right? And people have confused the kind of capitalist accommodation, the neoliberal accommodation, to a certain kind of notion of feminism, like women's empowerment, you know, women in professions. These are all very nice middle-class accommodations to a capitalism that adjusted. They are not what feminism is radically asking us to think about, because feminism is addressing a 3 millennia or 4 millennia old structure. And the sort of feminism of post-1968 is the first time there's been a full-blown theoretical elaboration across all the disciplines, right? Feminist theory is the first time we've had systematically women having got the vote, got education, got into universities, going to university in their own name to say, the sociology, let's rethink sociology, let's rethink philosophy, let's rethink physics, let's rethink gender, genetics, let's rethink literary studies, let's rethink art history. All of the disciplines are now subject to this questioning, right? And while the media presents some notion that feminism, you know, has worked, or that everybody's a feminist because they say, I determine my own life, I know who I am, you're talking neoliberalism. It's nothing to do with a deep feminist analysis and this questioning. If I can do it this way, every time you take one plane of analysis, something pierces it and says, what does it look like from this other angle? You know, when you say women, do you mean me? What woman are you talking about? What woman, white woman, are you talking about? Right? And I have to say, yeah, indeed, you know, and how does this look from other points? So, you know, what do I have to read to displace myself constantly from this image? This is the sort of Hollywood image, and the one that's perpetuated on the media, because this notion of women empowerment. I don't want power. I don't want to be empowered. You know, I want all of us to live human lives in decency and safety in ways that capitalism, racism, the legacies of colonialism, and the continuing violence make impossible for the majority. Women are the largest number of the poor, the majority of the poor, the majority of the abused, the majority of the illiterate, right? The majority of people who die from gender-related diseases, right? The majority of people who have no freedom over the disposition of their own bodies, you know, that's systematic, right? Majority, and in every category you have about Black, the category of Black, you'll have the majority of their just impoverished are in the category of women. In the category of queer, you'll find that's, you know, again, another dimension of where these entanglements and how they work. And I think we are losing sight of the radicalism as we have become accommodated to a neoliberal imagination. It's permeated everything, and it's permeated the art world more deeply than anything. Complete marketization and financialization of art, right? You cannot be an artist now unless the market gives you some, you know, financial value. And I think these questions are therefore, I don't think we're generating new women myths. I think that you see, that's also part of this thinking. There's always something new. No, we're deconstructing all the time. We will never rest, because the minute we arrive at one thing, we'll realize it's incomplete. There's something else to challenge it. So I'm not producing new myths. So we don't have a whole lot of great women artists. I want a completely different way of understanding what art does and what we can learn from working with it.
And the last one here, Victoria. So
Victoria, seems that there are specific ways for or making questions. Do you think there's a specific way? No, I don't think there's a specific way. All I can say, and what I tried to present to you today, is as I was confronted as a product of the generation of 68, right? I was historically, you know, my generation in geography, I found myself in Europe in 1968 at a point where young people protested against the post-war capitalist settlement. They protested against the colonial war in Vietnam. They protested against the persecution and violence against gay and lesbians, as we were then called. They protested against the violence against the lack of civil rights of African Americans, right? They were beginning to understand and borrow from decolonization, the politics of decolonization struggles. In that situation, I was offered all sorts of possibilities, sorts of excitements and conversations, and we did that. And I have just slowly over my life tried to produce concepts with which to think these problems, each time reacting to somebody saying to me, you haven't thought about that. What about that? Or discovering that there was something else that I was blinded to, right? You know, that something is ongoing work. And I don't specify this for any, I just want to share with people a particular dedication of 50 years to this question and the forms of the practice that I have created to approach them. And I think there are lots and lots of different ways of doing it. And as I come sort of, you know, I'm now in my 70s, you know, I realize that there are other urgencies which are exciting younger figures, and they may find what I've done too heavy. I keep getting publishers saying, nobody's going to want to read all this psychoanalysis. And I say, you've got to, you need it. Got to have a psychosymbolic element. So I continue to do my stuff, and we will see what everybody else is doing, but the legacy is just there, and it'll either be ignored or it'll cook. You know, it'll be something that other people will cook with.
Okay, so it was the last one. So thank you very much. It was really a pleasure to hear you and to have this unbelievable talk. And well, thank you for your time. And well, it's been a great.
I have to just say it's a privilege for me, because obviously in our lockdown and in isolation, I don't have the daily encounters with my students, who have been the source of most of my development in my life, is working with young people and beginning to try and see what the world is like for them, what the world was like for me, and how we do that. It's always a pleasure to have an opportunity to meet with you all. I wish I could be with you and sit and drink wine with you and have many more conversations than on a chat. But I thank you for your questions, and it's been a privilege and an honor for me to have my virtual visit to Bogota this afternoon. So if anybody has other questions, please email me and be in contact and see if we can use this as a connection.
Absolutely, that's the most important thing. And so I don't know if everybody wants to say goodbye to Griselda and maybe open the camera, whatever. Okay, we will see. Okay.
Thank you very much, Griselda. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. We can't.
Yes, finally,
that's right. We can't touch it to all of you. Okay. Hasta la vista.
Hasta la
Hasta
vista.
luego.
Hasta luego.
Hasta luego. Okay. I wish I
Okay.
could do the next one in Spanish, and I hope my pronunciation was not too.
It was very good. It was incredible, and
Except, but
it was
it's very
so touching. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, I would like to have done more and shown you lots of movies. And please do listen to the last. If you can see the PowerPoint, it's with Placido Domingo, who of course is now accused of sexual abuse, and so he's not singing anymore from all of that, etc. But it's a beautiful, beautiful sort of account of this, what Puccini made us remember about pain. Okay.
So we keep in touch, and okay, I will tell you about I recorded, so probably I will send you, yeah, exactly, yeah, and the link to watch the conference. So I don't know if someone wants to say something to Griselda.
I hope this was interesting and useful.
Absolutely.
To all of you in different ways, and I wish you well for your own and wonderful studies. Keep being art historians.
That's great.
Okay.
Okay, Griselda.
Okay.
So have a great night right now for you.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. You have another. You must have some lunch now and then have another session.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thank you. Bueno, muchas gracias a todos, a todas. Los esperamos entonces ahora a las 2 con Silvia Suárez para proseguir el coloquio, y mañana tenemos otra sesión con Luis Sebastián Sanabria, y por la tarde nuestros jóvenes investigadores que nos tendrán pues muchas sorpresas en este cuarto coloquio de Historia del Arte virtual. Entonces, muy amables a todos y esperamos verlos muy pronto.
Gracias.
Gracias, Diego.
Gracias, Diego.
Gracias, Ricardo. Nos vemos entonces.